Thank you all very much for attending today. So very much just really want to make sure that we can today really help give guidance around really a common activity that a lot of organizations are looking to do around achieving Cyber Essentials Plus as a standard within the organization, and just kind of give the experience of both, achieving additional kind of security accreditations internally for ourselves, but also the work that we've done with many different customers across a lot of different industries in terms of helping them to improve and kind of really kind of implement security profile and security services and processes within their organization. So today, the speakers that we'll have with us is, you've got my good self, which is Phil Mercer. So I am the managing director at PowerOn, but I do very much like to keep myself hands in. So, I do quite a bit of support and work and kind of pre-sales or kind of business consultancy type activity with our customers. So very much kind of engaged with really kind of getting into detail. I do tend to have a bit of a strap line of saying I'm technical but not the techie, and that's very much where I'm then joined by my partner in crime for today, Mr. Steve Beaumont. And Steve, you would like to say hello?
Thank you very much, Phil. Hi everyone, so my name is Steve Beaumont, as Phil's just mentioned, and I am certainly the geeky techie of the side of the duo for today. So I spent a lot of time in the industry now across a wide range of different verticals and industries, diving deep though into that device management aspect and how we look at configuring and controlling and securing things like the desktop and the infrastructure of the estate.
Great, and if you just like to go to the next. Essentially as well, so as mentioned at the start of this, we do like to do these sessions as kind of providing knowledge. So we're not going to be doing any kind of hard sales pitches or anything in this for you today, but just for those that might not have worked with us or just kind of a bit of awareness of really where do we come from, an expertise relevant to this type of area. PowerOn have been in operation for quite a few years now, and very much we are a specialized partner focusing on the kind of management and security space with customers. And we've been doing this for a wide range of kind of organizations up to large enterprise, but also kind of core, kind of enterprise and public sector and educational organizations from a consultancy perspective as well. So I suppose, our experience is really helping guide businesses, but also because we deliver managed services, helping actually implement and execute these operational services for customers. So we've got a good range of experience in terms of being able to actually help change organization structures and security processes, but also actually implement and operate those kind of processes as well for customer organizations. So without further ado, I will certainly then we'll get into the actual interesting parts and start going through the discussion. So Steve, would you like to kick us off?
Thank you very much. So hopefully a rather redundant slide for the day. Everyone that's joined this call hopefully is aware of what Cyber Essentials is, and basically being that government-backed scheme that is designed not to be to the nth degree of you must meet all these individual, this registry key must be set at this variable, like some of the NIST frameworks and stuff that show you the actual behind the scenes configuration side, but actually looking at a range of strategies and intents to help control and prevent or mitigate the basic threats carried out by most of the unskilled attackers, which are the vast majority of the things that we see within the industry attacking organizations. And by that, I mean, it's not going to give you the belts and braces approach to stop a nation state actor getting into your environment and getting what they want. This is designed to start to protect your resources at that level where your common end users are not going to leave you open to vulnerabilities, basically, and closing the common doors that usually get abused as opportunistic attacks more than anything. So the framework looks at the Cyber Essentials certification looks at providing the advice and the guidance across 5 main technical controls, which we'll go through today and just dive a little bit deeper into what some of the fundamentals that you can do to get yourself ready for that. And as we build across the basics of the Cyber Essentials initial certification, how you then look to additively grow on top of that and add more to help you pass the Cyber Essentials Plus. So while the Cyber Essentials piece is basically almost a self-certification piece, where you go through and you have to answer a series of questions, something that I'm having the joy of going back through for our annual tests this year, where you answer questions and make sure that you meet certain controls, that then your answers get verified and you gain that certification side. The plus element brings in an actual organization that will actually perform tests against your base builds, your edge infrastructures and stuff, to make sure that you do have them controls in place which would stop the average attacker. So I mentioned around these 5 main key controls. They tend to focus around the firewall. What have you got that's actually making sure that connections into and out of potentially your environment are secure? What is just stopping that attacker walking into your infrastructure? Making sure that the configuration that you apply to your devices internally is secure. So making sure that they have that common sense approach of, yes, we have passwords on devices. Yes, we have that. What does that look like in terms of what you've created to lock down their machines slightly? Now, the access control is an area that's not just about purely making sure that users can't get in, or sorry, attackers can't get in, but actually, what do you do around the rights and the management of your end users and your admins? How do you control who has access to what, who is onboarded into your environment? Malware protection goes without saying. We need to have something that stops malicious code running. And then patch management. Are we closing down vulnerabilities as they are discovered? So these are the 5 main key areas that get looked at for the assessments that you need to have something behind, both from a technical standpoint and also from a control and process perspective. And that'll be something that becomes very apparent as I continue talking throughout the rest of this session, that processes underpin everything. You cannot just simply implement something without knowing how you're going to control it throughout the life cycle and between audits and just generally ongoing. So let's dive a little bit deeper into each one of these main key areas. So firewalls are, well, they've been around since the dawn of time, to be honest, haven't they? But what we tend to look at to achieve the Cyber Essentials side of it is making sure that you have a boundary firewall. So what is actually in place on that boundary between the internet and your internal networks. Now, as we've got lots and lots of people working from home at the moment, especially with everything that's going on, that obviously is meaning that the endpoints are starting to roam out of necessarily your LAN and your internal boundary where you have that corporate owned firewall. But that broadband router should certainly have some form of firewall on, just on a user's home network, that makes sure that the attackers, again, don't have unfettered access to everything within that environment. So it is something to make sure that end users, if they are working from home, don't just by default go and disable their firewall. I'd probably argue that the majority of home users don't know how to, so it's pretty safe to say it's on. But some form of policy should be in place for your home workers to say that they must make sure that they have a firewall enabled on their broadband router. Now, that's fine for when they're in the network or when they are at home, but generally your laptops, say your desktops as well, but certainly your laptops, which are the roaming aspects, if they're going to go and drop into a coffee shop, well, that's going to be happening anytime soon at the minute, but the devices themselves should have a host firewall on. It used to be very common practice to have the firewall disabled on the Windows side. Now, that's not so much when we get to the Windows 10 era, but certainly XP 7, I'll start showing my age if I go anywhere before that, they specifically had them disabled because it was a lot of overhead to manage. Now, the firewalls on Windows 10, etc., are very good in terms of both the centralized management side and just generally not getting in the way of most day-to-day operations. So please do make sure that they are turned on. Or if you have a third-party product and it's built into your AV systems and stuff, use that. All your client devices should have the host firewall turned on. In that same vein, The default configuration of both your edge firewall, your boundary firewalls, and your internal firewalls should not be just left at their default configuration. There's no good go out and buying a nice Ubiquiti USG or a Cisco firewall, put it in place, and leaving the password as root, for example. Make sure one of them first activities that you do and revisit your existing equipment, that the passwords are changed to something that's more secure and unique for the different devices, and get that recorded and securely stored with audited access of who can actually get to it. Again, go through the default configurations, not just on the password side, but little settings like, oh yes, we allow remote management to the entire world. Turn it off. Make sure you harden it slightly, even if it is just turning off the most common sense items. And again, with your host firewalls, turn off any that are specifically deemed as gaps, like SMB1 access and so on. Just make sure you take it away from the base configuration that may be less secure. But certainly the passwords, get them changed. Talk about the service access side. So while the default configuration, you might turn off something like accessing the configuration interface from external on your boundary firewalls. But then generally, if you have services that you offer out from your internal network to customers or partners, etc., on the external side of it, so either whether they're coming in via a VPN interface or whether you're just publishing a web server directly out via firewall, they must be documented. It's not to say don't do it. I would potentially argue that you could go to the next step level and looking at different ways of doing it and publishing out services. But if you do have rules on your firewall that says allow this to this, and it's going out from the external side, they must absolutely be documented and controlled and have a policy in place that shows the intent and the process followed in terms of things like change control, who can do it, risk assessments that happen across that. And this goes back to that point I made a minute ago, that it's not just about implementing the technology side. So having that policy and that process in place that controls things like service access requests and implementations, the configuration documentation around what your passwords are, what the configuration of them devices are, again, who has access to it, is very important, because that helps bolster your assessments when you put them in, rather than just being able to answer the question as, yes, we do it. It's, yes, we do it to this process. And I'll repeat this throughout it. You must think about how you are controlling these changes, these configurations, and the accesses within your environment. So, mentioned a bit ago on the initial 5 key areas that the secure configuration comes into play, and looking at how we secure down these devices. So, as I mentioned, it's not about saying that all these registry keys must be set at this certain point, or these group policies must absolutely be set to these values. Again, it's about looking at these common top level areas that should absolutely be focused on. And then everything after that is more about the granular depth of control that you go for your risk appetite within your business. Now, in terms of the secure configuration, some of the most insecure aspects of the devices comes down to what's installed on them and how things are accessed. So looking at removing unwanted stuff within your environment is very key. So look at the software. If it's a case of your devices have either come shipped with pre-imaged factory images on the devices, and it comes with trials of things, get them off. Absolutely. If it's a case of you had a piece of software that you deployed out a few years ago and then you found a better piece of software, don't leave that old one on the machine. If it's not being used and it's not actively being maintained, which is even more important, it can introduce the vulnerabilities into your environment that you're either not aware of because you're not actually focused on it because no one's using it, or you don't have a system that automatically patches it, or the manufacturer's not supplying the patches. So take it off the system. And that does become important. That one of the main things that you need to be able to show within the Cyber Essentials qualification is that you are only using supported and maintained software. If your favorite application in the world has been deprecated by the manufacturer 10 times over for newer versions, you must start to think about moving away from that. Otherwise, you will not meet the controls that are in place for it. Yes, there's potentially a cost involved in there, relicensing, redeploying, but it has to be done. Similarly, passwords, making sure the users have that good hygiene practice, making sure you have a access management policy that shows the users what they should or shouldn't do, regardless of whether you have something in control that absolutely enforces it, but having that control mechanism that users know that they should abide to, and hopefully backing it up with something that can enforce it. Make sure that the users have a minimum of 8-character passwords, and then hopefully make them complex and unique and stuff as well. You can go again, like anything, to the nth degree, and there's lots of useful tools out there that you can use to help with even more best practices, like not reusing common passwords and stuff. We might discuss a bit of that later. But the password management side, what do you do when you actually think that a password might have leaked? Either taking in reports from end users where they go, oh, Fred was looking over my shoulder the other day and he saw me type in my password. What is your policy for being able to handle that? Is it just simply you have a policy that says, if you're concerned, raise a job with the help desk and we'll get it reset for you? Or do you go to the extent of actually having a breach management notification from one of the various dumps online that will help notify you when somebody's credentials are leaked, and then you can pick that up and proactively go and change it? And again, having them policies in place that both how do you change the when do you change the password, how the password should be set in terms of controls and stuff, but also how do you handle the lockout procedures, how do you notify users that they know where to go, where to look to understand these policies and how they actually work in actuality. Now talk about the access to the environment. So the access control, again, these all kind of loop into each other. So it's all right having the right sorts of passwords to access your machines, making sure it's not got unwanted software on there and stuff. But again, how do we know when even new users are starting in the environment, when they've left? Have we got stale accounts in the environment? How do we know what them users can access? So again, having these policies and procedures in place and some tool sets if you've got them to be able to help do it, but having the actual documentation that tells users how they should use it, how a line manager might request a new starter, or does that flow down from HR? How long accounts will be kept when somebody leaves? What is the process for taking their information off and handing over to somebody else? Does it get disabled first? Does it get immediately deleted? All that lot needs to be thought about, documented, and be able to be followed and presented if needed be for an audit. Comes down to that same similar conversation with the whole privilege management. Who has access to what? You should absolutely only have one account per person. Now, while there might be need for service accounts for running certain applications and stuff, that is not the same as having that shared or generic type of account where multiple people are logging into machines, which absolutely should not be used. It's about being able to present both the audit capabilities as well as having it for the right roles and the tasks that you're performing. So while one person will generally have one account, if that person, as part of their privilege management, needs to access administrative functions, so they either need to be able to log on to servers, log on as domain admin, they should not be having the usage of the same account that they use for browsing email or browsing the web, or reading email, browsing the web, with their domain admin account. That's just such a bad no-no. making sure that they have segregated duties, segregated accounts that are only given the right amount of privileges at the right time is all important when it comes to going through the access control parts of Cyber Essentials. There is no excuse for going and dropping the users group into the domain admins group. And in the same vein, the admins need to get used to either having separate accounts for doing them administrative tasks or looking at different tool sets that will allow them to elevate when they need it for a short amount of time, but not on the same device that they're doing their daily office tasks. And this is a conversation that has gained so much traction over the last year or so that it should almost be the de facto standard now, and that's around multi-factor authentication. Now, for administrative accounts, it's a hard requirement. There should be no reason not to use it. However, with all the improvements that are in place and the options that we have around some of the Microsoft stacks and so on, applying multi-factor authentication for all of your users is almost a non-starter conversation in terms of not doing it. It's one of the best defenses out there across a range of different identity threats. And because so many people are used to it now with accessing banking details and so on, with the personal banking, accessing other services that have brought it in, it's not a complete unknown or technical only aspect. It's very easy to implement, very easy for users to understand, and very important, especially as more and more services move out onto the internet, and you get things like Office 365 and stuff where data's secured up there that's not within the boundary controls of just your internal network, protecting the users that are logging on. So absolutely, it should be a mandated thing for administrative users, and it should be very high on the list of making sure that the rest of your users are covered with it wherever possible. And that does absolutely come up in the conversations for the Cyber Essentials qualification. All of these key points do, making sure that you have them processes of who can access what, when accounts are created, what accounts are they using for what activities, policied and documented and shown, and then the controls in place that you can start looking to bring in easier things to make life, tool sets to make life easier when you're doing this stuff, and the protection controls around things like the MFA side. Now, it seems kind of a redundant conversation because everyone these days are aware of how important it is to have antivirus on the system. But when we talk around that malware protection side of Cyber Essentials, it's not just about the AV piece. Yes, AV is absolutely important and it's there and it should be enabled, and real-time scanning should absolutely be enabled. But make sure it's updated. If you are not properly monitoring and being able to report on which of your devices are not updating their AV and that it's in scope and compliant at all times, it will be a letdown. But then starting to look at how you expand that out from just that traditional sort of file scanning side and start to look at how we can extend it into, and this could be with third-party tools, but things like Windows Defender Smart Screen, bringing that web page scanning, trying to prevent users from getting to malicious sites before they get the chance to go and browse on that link that's going to compromise your system, do also come into play. Network inspection, all the enhanced stuff that's just that little bit above that default antivirus control. But then we do go to that next stage. So using this in combination with that first piece that we mentioned around secure configuration and looking at removing unwanted software off the devices means that you do have to start to think around how you do application control that limits what can run on the devices. And this is why it's important to get rid of the stuff you don't use, because you need to then understand properly what your application set within your environment looks like, be able to start to define up whitelisting of applications to say only these documented, approved, controlled applications can run on a device. Now, there is a lot that can go into this, especially if your environment is not already centrally managed with applications deployed with known file locations. It can take a bit of effort to start to go through to look or relook at your environment and try and pick apart where things have been installed, how they've been installed, are they just unsigned binaries and so on, which we'll go on to next because that's another question. But how we can start to implement things like App Locker or Defender application control to be able to control the running of applications. Now, in terms of the application signing side, this is going that one step further. Now, you can say that an application is approved and we've packaged it and we've said that this is our definitive, we are allowed to run this in place. But as you start to go down to that level where you say, well, actually, we're going to put a policy in place that only allows Microsoft signed, Adobe signed, Citrix signed, digitally signed, code signed applications to run on our systems. That's easier for some than others. That does mean that you can start to find some of certainly the older legacy. And I'll say there's even some newer applications that still come through that are not code signed. So again, you almost have to have that business policy or that decision internally that says whether you do or don't allow that. Yes, there can be edge cases, again, as long as they are documented, you know and understand the risk, and you limit and mitigate the risk in a different manner. That can be done. But for the vast majority of things, you start to look at how far you can lock that piece down. There's also the aspect of, well, actually, fine, if it's something that you're bringing in for the first time and it's not yet gone through our approval process, it's not been fully vetted, it's not been added to things like our control lists with App Locker or Defender application control, how do we sandbox that application away and do that testing piece before allowing it to be released into that production environment? Now, there's some cool stuff coming through with Windows 10. So I think it was 1909, kind of, but 2004 onwards, or 2004 onwards, sorry, with Windows Sandbox. So it actually has something with the name Sandbox in it, which ticks all the boxes, but that spins up basically a mini hypervised environment, or cannot speak today for toffee, mini virtualized environment on the hypervisor level that allows you to have no interaction with your internal resources, where you can go and test some of this application stuff, and then the environment is disposed of when you finish testing with it. So it's a non-persistent virtual environment with a secure Windows environment that you can then go and test some of these bits. There's also further extensions that I can talk around later with things like application guard and stuff. And then we have that piece around the patch management. Now, I don't think anyone's going to argue around how important it is, especially with the amount of 0 days and vulnerabilities and some very nasty vulnerabilities that we've seen in the past. Obviously, the NHS will know all too well with their lovely efforts with WannaCry, etc. But then some of the recent ones that we've seen around domain controller privileged escalations and stuff that always seem to be consistently coming to the forefront very quickly at the moment, that patching is the best way to prevent the majority of them vulnerabilities. Now, in terms of the definition scope of the Cyber Essentials side, we absolutely, again, I've mentioned around supported apps, but the supported OS. So you must be running on the supported OS, which if you're a Windows estate, which the majority of organizations are, that means Windows 10. Not only does it mean Windows 10, it also means making sure you are in the supported lifecycle of Windows 10. Now, I've put the carte blanche statement on there that 1909 should be the minimum that you're currently on. You could be on it on 1803 or 1809 for a little bit longer, but those are rapidly coming out of support. I think, Phil, refresh my memory, is it November, so this month for 1803, and then March because Microsoft extended them for 1809, and then 1909 will be the one that runs for a little bit longer, but you already have 2004 and 20H2 in play. So that ongoing life cycle and the support level for these OSs must be adhered to. You can't sit on 15.11 for the rest of your life. You have to have a mechanism of making sure that OS goes up to date when is needed. That also means making sure that all your apps are supported and work with that new OS. And this is probably one of the biggest changes for most organizations in trying to keep up with the speed. And if you want to go down the Cyber Essentials route, this is very important. You must be within support, because you then need to be in support to get the patches to fix the vulnerabilities, hence the patch management piece. You can't patch what isn't supported across the OS and the third-party apps. So remove third-party apps when they are not supported anymore, and they will not receive security updates. And just to call out, if you're not aware, that includes Adobe Flash. Support for Adobe Flash ends next month. Now, there are still a lot of applications that use Adobe Flash. We work quite extensively with the NHS. We know there's a lot of applications in the NHS that use Adobe Flash. Like I say, the support for it will end in December. You need to start thinking about what your roadmap plan to replace them applications or work with the vendors to get new versions that don't run Adobe Flash. If you have no choice other than to stay with that, then to keep within the support cycle for to meet the requirements for Cyber Essentials, you will have no choice but to go and speak to a third-party licensing vendor that Adobe has done some deals with to create a custom plan for support and maintenance of Flash. No idea what the costings on that is. You can imagine it's going to cost an arm and a leg, but this shows how important it is, if you want to meet qualifications like this, that plans are always put in place for removing non-supported applications, even when there's such a big thing as Adobe Flash. Now, while the support ends for that, there is an update already out that you can manually run to completely remove it from the OS. That update will become much more of a optional update in a few more months, coming from WSOS or Config Manager, or whichever way you do your updating, but it will be marked as a recommended and therefore deployed early next year. So there is no way to start avoiding this. You need to have the plans in place, but generally make sure that every app that you have within your environment has a support statement. You record that, you know that you can get security updates, and you are patching your third-party apps. It's no good just knowing about it. You need to have a mechanism to be able to actually update them to whatever the latest version that you required. Talk about updates and getting them out there. One of the requirements that we start to look at around the Cyber Essentials piece is the speed that you do your patches. So anything that is critical, you could go down a little bit more granular, and if you really get into the nitty-gritties of it, you're talking about ones with high threat CVS scores, so they talk about 7+. However, going through each one really granularly and trying to decide at that time can be quite a bit of overhead for most IT organizations. I certainly haven't got time every single time a bulletin is released, which there's multiples daily, to sit and decide whether I need to do an emergency plan deployment. It's easier to start looking at how you can adopt a much more rapid general approach to patching, and basically just say any update that is flagged as critical, regardless of whether it's a CVSS score of 5, 6, or 7, or 8, don't really care. If it's marked as critical and security, just deploy it so that all your devices are updated within 14 days. That 14 days is a requirement from the Cyber Essentials side. So you need to work out what your patching strategy is to get these updates out, still in a controlled manner. I wouldn't recommend going and deploying every single update to every single machine in your environment on day one, but still look at really reducing your cycle of these updates to devices. And this isn't just selectively We deployed it to 5 or 6, that's okay. We've got these extra 200 devices that are sat somewhere in the business that we're not going to patch because we're a bit more worried about them. No, this is to get all devices that are active within your environment up to date for critical patches within 14 days. Sounds like I'm stressing it and taking a bit of time over it. It's because I am, because it's a big mind shift change for most organizations. It goes away from that selective choosing of patches here and there, doing the assessments, doing a bit of testing, and going much more into that quicker speed of deploying, knowing your estate that is standardized well enough and phasing it out across to capture the non-critical ones first to be able to put a hold on it while you go and assess it quickly to then let it continue across the rest of the estate. So that was the main key areas. So I mentioned the 5 main key areas of firewall, secure configuration, access control, malware protection, and patch management. But there is that underlying thing that pins across all of it, kind of a 6th area, but it's the processes. If you don't, you can have the best tool sets in the world, but if you don't have the actual controls and people know how and why things are being done, it doesn't work. The tool set's just sat there, nobody's checking it, there's not an actual policy in place that says you must go and do this, this, and this. Users don't know why they should be doing secure passwords, they don't know who to look for to request a new user account. And all of this lot does absolutely, and it's really important to stress, takes business change and commitment. It's no good being told from the business, oh yes, you must go and get Cyber Essentials Plus. And then you start to go back and say, well, actually, fine, we need to change this and we need to patch within 14 days. The business goes, no, we can't have the interruption. They have to be along for the journey. They have to understand why we're doing it, and they have to themselves commit to being able to help you achieve this. Because if you're not, if they're not committed and they're going to put blockers in place, you're not going to achieve this. Now, talking about the tool sets that can help you support some of this side, obviously from a Microsoft perspective, we're a very heavy Microsoft partner, and this is what we are using internally at PowerOn to achieve all of this. We have the Microsoft tool sets that, while they don't supply hardware firewall, so I probably should have moved that across into third-party tools, but there should be a hardware firewall on the boundary, but then you can use the Windows Defender firewall on your host devices. Cover that aspect off. You don't have to have something separate. Obviously, if you've already got that built into things like McAfee or Sophos or Summit, then fine, that's your choice. You can look at using that. But you still need to make sure it's controlled, it's centrally documented, you know how it's done. In terms of the secure configuration, fine. You have a policy control system that you need to use to set some of these things around, things like password complexity, lockout timings, whether you want to go and lock it down a bit further and say, fine, need to make sure the BitLockers on the machines and so on, then have either something like Active Directory, or if you're moving much more to that cloud style world, where you use something like Microsoft Endpoint Manager with either Config Manager or Intune to help you either reach out and touch some devices that are not necessarily joined to your on-premises directory, like ours. So we're just purely Azure AD joined. So we have Intune that's supplying the policy control sets, but then also making sure that we can use that to remove applications and install applications. So bringing in that secure configuration around only having on the machines what we define from a central point. Again, third-party tools sets out there. If you've got Avanti, Delcase, other tool sets like that, great. They can do similar jobs. It just depends on to what level you need to get to. I'd probably invariably argue that when it comes to the configuration side, either Active Directory or preferably Intune are much more robust for setting the policy controls than trying to do that within the Delcase world. But then doing the application deployment, it's kind of like a, yeah, take your poison on that side. But it's always good to have one tool rather than multiples, just for both simplicity and cost. Now, the access control side, making sure that users only get to where they want. I mentioned the MFA side. There are absolutely stuff within the Azure Active Directory side, the Azure multi-factor authentication, Azure privileged identity management. So elevating when you need certain rights and roles. So don't sit in Azure as a global admin or an Intune admin, but instead put a request in via PIM to say, I need to elevate, or I need to request the privileges that I need to do this task for the next 1 hour. Now, there is licensing that underpins that. So whereas things like Azure MFA and stuff might be covered under the P1 licensing, in some respects for admins and stuff, it's free. But when you want to roll out to users, P1 licensing, Azure PIM would come under a P2 licensing scheme, for example. So yes, there is costs under this if you don't already have it. If you already have access to these things and you're not using it, why? Really quick, easy things to go look at to help control and lock down your environment to go forward into the assessments on these. Now, there's third-party tools and stuff. So admin by request is a really good one. So if you wanted to, this is a really good one. So one of the control mechanisms within the Cyber Essentials is making sure that users are not local admins. So again, that whole thing of you should not be running as an admin when you're reading your emails and browsing, etc. If you have developers, if you have really old legacy apps where you've had no choice but to make the user a local admin, getting away from them without a lot of effort is actually something that things like admin by request and CyberArk can bring in. Admin by request puts in a little thing on the system tray where users can elevate just the application. They don't need to be sat in the local admin group. They can say, well, actually, I just want to be able to run this, and I can either request access and get it approved, or you can mark pre-approved, and it just allows you to actually move that boundary of privilege. So this is talking about privileged access management away from I am permanently an admin to I just need this application or this session for a set period of time to be privileged. Much better world to be in than having lots of people in the local admins group. Malware protection. So the majority of people will know that Defender is built into the Windows 10 OS. So you have a base level of antivirus control, even if you have nothing else from a third party perspective. Some people will still prefer to have the likes of Sophos and stuff on the machines. Fine. If you haven't, or you still have doubt, go check out the AV tests, because Windows Defender is actually really cool and does very, very well, if not at the top of the stack now of the independent tests. It's not, as you used to remember with things like Microsoft Security Essentials. That was diabolical. Defender actually works. But then as you step up the control levels and you start to think around using things like ATP, so advanced threat protection for the Windows Defender stack, kind of the equivalent to things like Carbon Black or Red Cloak that you might have heard, there are the Microsoft tool sets that are in there. There are just obviously costs attached to it. But looking at things like application control and app blocker, they're natively part of the OS. Don't have to go anywhere else for that. Bring in that application whitelisting, the application signing. They are there, and you are basically licensed to use it if you are running on the enterprise SKU of Windows 10. I will say that it takes a fair bit of effort to properly put them in without breaking everything within your environment. Now, your patch management, if you've got nothing else, then fine, WSUS is there, it can be used. Still a little bit tedious to be able to get working in a controlled fashion. Microsoft Endpoint Manager, either the config manager component or Intune in terms of being able to define the Windows Update for Business, are absolutely there to help you automate the phased approaches of the deployment of patches to your estate, being able to make sure that you stagger them updates, but still in a timely and orderly fashion, and being able to halt the process if you do have any problems. It's not to say halt indefinitely, it's stop while you assess what the risk and the damage is, fix, and then continue. Again, you could do it with third-party tools and stuff, but it's for me personally, having it used the stuff that's built into the OSs and just applying it through the control policy side is probably why I go with the Microsoft side rather than a third party that kind of build their own mechanisms towards it. Now, from Power On side, we absolutely cover lots of different scenarios where we can help implement, control, define, and map out and deliver these type of things. Various different consultancy side, managed service provider aspects. It depends on what your requirements are, or if it's just to be able to actually have conversations like this, to be able to show you the type of approach or define what it might be that you need to be able to do to achieve it. So I'm going to take a pause for breath and hand over to Phil.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that, Steve. I think that's probably one of the quietest I've ever been in a webinar session so far. So just being conscious of time and other bits and pieces, but we do like just to give the opportunity, if you do have any questions, if you want to just throw them into the questions section, then we've got probably 10 minutes maybe. To try and not run too far over, where we could certainly help answer those for you. Appreciative as well that at the moment we've given you quite a bit of information and food for thought in terms of that. So if we can help add some context to it, or just handle maybe things where you consider challenges, certainly happy to do so.
So one of the things I will just pick up on while people are potentially putting questions in there that I just thought about. So while talking around, those are the main key areas that we go through that are covered under the Cyber Essentials side of it. That additive approach, as we start to get towards the Cyber Essentials Plus, is basically the plus side means that an actual security focused company will come in and do tests against it. So for example, this year for our audit, I prepared one machine using our autopilot process. So I stepped through our internal process of creating a new user account, so commissioned Steve Jobs within our environment. We then use that account to provision a new device. So going through that autopilot process, applies all our security controls from Intune, secures and locks down the desktop, adds on things like the whole Windows Hello for Business with the biometrics. That's some of our password controls that come in place. Deployed our applications across from it, and then we hand that across to the actual company that we work with for certification, and they will run a series of tests against our base provisioned image to check things like, can they run portable executables on the system, or do we have things like application control in place? Can they go and launch PowerShell script with admin rights to change certain services? No, because they have local admin. They don't have local admin rights. So it's taking all of that stuff that we've said and basically handing it over for proper verification. The first step is fill out a form and self-certify yourself that yes, this is how we do it and what controls we have in place. And then you go to plus where you say, hey, can you now come and actually verify that we have got a secure environment? So they check both the desktop side and they will also check your external side. So things like, well, what's your IP ranges? What can we see in terms of open ports? Have you got things exposed? Have you got applications that you're presenting that have got vulnerabilities? And basically give you that feedback back to say, actually, we can't pass you because you've not got these controls in place, or you don't have this, and so on, or work with you to make sure that you can understand and work towards closing that before you can gain your certification.
Great. Just as a quick one as well, just to confirm as questions come through, one of the ones was certainly whether there'll be access to the recording. Absolutely. So as you've all registered for this, once the session finishes, you'll then get essentially a follow-up communication where you also then have access to essentially the on-demand recording for this. So you can then, kind of check in or peruse at your leisure, depending on the kind of bits of information you just might want to refresh your mind to as we kind of go through. I think just being conscious of time as well, a couple of bits and pieces, but essentially items such as handling the patching for a kind of an accelerated path such as 14 days. Is there any kind of common pitfalls or any kind of major considerations when people are kind of taking quite a changed approach to that, would you say, Steve? That's a question.
Certainly communications to end users. So it's like anything, because it's such a visible and business impactful change where users need to understand that they will be prompted to restart their device, that they can't just leave it on in the office or hidden in a drawer. So making sure that users are aware that they have to connect their devices within a timely fashion. Again, part of the policies that go out to all users. That's probably one of the biggest ones, to make sure devices are on, they're rebooted in a timely fashion to be able to report back compliancy. The other aspect is obviously understanding what software and stuff's out there in the environment and what potential impacts there are. If you don't understand that there's a machine that's running the door access system and you send out patches and it's on one of the first waves and reboots at 12 o'clock in the day, nobody can get in and out the office, then that's a potential pitfall.
Absolutely. I think just be mindful of time. I think just as a final bit, and what we'll do is any questions we'll certainly send follow-ups to, but also, you know, encourage if you do have questions following, do feel free to throw them over to us. We're quite happy to support. One of the points to note was around items such as the, you know, operating system support times and reporting across, you know, kind of status of events and things like that. Depending on the toolings that you put in place, you know, certainly if you were talking from, say, either an Intune or a endpoint manager kind of solution in terms of what would have been traditionally SCCM or config manager, as it essentially is still now, but just under the endpoint manager moniker, then you can certainly get a lot of good reporting. And we've helped kind of customers look towards either leveraging some simple Power BI extensions or kind of custom reporting sides where you can then start to see agent estate within your hardware and kind of take direct information from the Microsoft site, because it is one of the things where they are changing things just to kind of keep us all on our toes. You know, funnily, if we look at it, 1709 just went end of support start of October. But essentially, they did extend both 1803 and 1809 out to May, as Steve was saying earlier in the session. But funnily, 1903 actually expires December this year. So 1803 and 1809 have a longer support cycle than 1903. So there is things where it's obviously keeping that attention and keeping that eye to your estate, but ideally getting into the position where actually you're applying a standard default and bringing that up to speed each year. So as Steve was saying, 1909 really should be the minimum at the moment in an ideal world, as well as obviously then starting to move towards 20H2 as that starts to get the market validation in terms of it's being out and about as well. But just to close through then, what we'll do is to say, answer any questions following that through. You know, as Steve's mentioned as well, and, you know, as I mentioned at the start, you know, of course, there's quite a lot of information that we've provided, hopefully giving you some ideas and thoughts for those that are already on the journey, or kind of set a little bit of expectations for those that might be starting out. Of course, you know, the more that you can do yourselves, absolutely fantastic. But if there is areas where you could need support, Steve mentioned some, you know, quite commonly we can help shape what we kind of call solution alignments or kind of those kind of planning workshops where essentially can help set you out what is the gap, what is the path, and what is the kind of recommended ways to actually address these kind of things, of course, help you implement those, or even go to the degree that if you just actually want a partner to help handle patching for you, we can do that as well. But in that case, you know, do feel free to reach out to us. I think, you know, what we do try and do as well is obviously keep these kinds of sessions, you know, and kind of keep a regular element of these going. So hopefully if you found this useful, and please feel free to provide feedback, as we do welcome it, to make sure that we're improving these types of things. Just check out the Learning Hub on our website, or of course, you know, if you want to join our mailing list as well, you'll certainly be contacting that. We've got another couple of bits and pieces coming up that hopefully you'll find interesting in the not so distant future, and plenty more planned for moving ahead. But essentially, with that said, if you do want to reach out to us, either get in touch with an account manager if you do have it, or just drop us a note through at info@Power On Platforms, and we're certainly happy to assist you if you'd like. And of course, as anything, we do thank you for your attendance, and hopefully you found this very useful. But with that, we'll bring it to an end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.